Um, our first speaker for this afternoon is Elina Teplinsky, hailing from right here in New York by way of Belarus. Elina received her law degree from Fordham University and is now a partner with Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw, Pittman, where she leads the firm's international nuclear projects and hydrogen teams. During her tenure, she represented Akuyu Nuclear on the development of the first nuclear power plant in Turkey. She also represented Brookfield on their acquisition of Westinghouse. And she has represented a nuclear project developer in the implementation of new projects in South America and Africa. She is a strategic advisory group member of the International Bank for Nuclear Infrastructure and has a wealth of information on nuclear financing, especially in light of last year's Inflation Reduction Act. So please join me in welcoming her. Thank you.
I have to stand at the podium. Ooh. Okay. Yeah, that would be great. So I can walk around and make this a little more casual since everyone just had a nice lunch. I want to make sure everyone is awake. This is the presentation about how to get money for more nuclear, which is obviously essential to getting more nuclear online. We already heard during the first part of the day that we need a lot more nuclear for decarbonization, not just for the power sector, but for all of the parts of the economy, especially the hard-to-abate sectors. And if you look at some of the numbers coming out there, and some of them are actually pretty conservative, the International Energy Agency says we need to at least triple the investment into nuclear by 2030 to meet our decarbonization goals. And that's a pretty tall task. If you look at, just back of the envelope math, think about 1 gigawatt. How much does 1 gigawatt cost? Let's say conservatively, $5 billion, not in the West, let's say in China. If we're going to double the capacity, just double, not triple the capacity of nuclear, times that by about 400 gigawatts, that's at least $2 trillion, right? That is a lot of money. And if you look at the trajectory of nuclear over the past couple of decades, it's pretty much been stagnant. Since we've built fleets of reactors in the 60s and the 70s, we've been at this level of about 10% of energy capacity. And nuclear is the second largest firm clean energy source after hydro. So with hydro, we're basically tapped out, most of the world. In nuclear, we can grow, right? Because we're not limited to having to dam the rivers and the other bodies that exist, but we've been pretty stagnant. And of course, the impediment to the growth of nuclear is also the impediment to our ability to decarbonize. So why have we been stagnant? That could be a whole separate talk. But from kind of a really high level point of view, nuclear reactors, the large nuclear reactors we have today are very expensive. To just build a single reactor, and they're usually built in 2s and 4s, we're looking at, $10 billion, $20 billion, $30 billion, depending on the size of the reactor and where you build it. That is a lot of capital. Historically, the financing of these reactors has been done in 2 ways. One, by governments. So there's some governments that can afford and want to have a policy to finance domestic buildup of nuclear. One example is China, all being done with state funds. Another example is Russia. Even countries like France in the West, and mostly done it with government funds. You have EDF, that's a state-owned utility. The other source has been the balance sheets of big corporates, mostly electric utilities. So here in the United States, where we don't have a publicly owned nuclear sector, we've been basically asking electric utilities to put their balance sheets up for risk in order to finance new nuclear. And guess what? That hasn't worked too well. Companies that even announce that they're going to build new nuclear, the credit rating immediately goes down because the expectation is that these are very large projects, they're complex, and in the West, because we've had gaps in building new nuclear, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? We haven't built new nuclear in a long time, so we don't really know how to build it. We don't have the regulatory capacity necessarily to support significant buildup. So immediately we're going to get a credit down rating even before we start doing it. And that prevents people from coming to in the market to actually finance new nuclear and build up that capacity so we can bring the cost down. So it's been quite difficult. This is one of the reasons that small modular reactors has been seen as a way to ramp up that capacity, right? I think most of you in the room know about SMRs. SMRs are smaller, so that means a lower capital cost. They are modular, so that means less construction. It means you can fabricate the modules in the factory, you can bring them to the site. Most of the work is more on the installation side rather than construction, so you don't have 500 work packages that all have to be integrated. You just have a module that you can mostly install, and the construction work is not as significant. And then because you have smaller projects, the development timelines are also shorter. And that means that the capital outlay and the cost of interest rates, right? Imagine when you get money for anything, let's say you take out a mortgage, right? The longer your mortgage, the more the property costs at the end of the day. And that's exactly what things look like for nuclear. If you had nuclear built in the same timelines as solar and wind, or even conventional power, natural gas, CCGT, 2-3 years, the interest rate, the weighted average interest rate costs are one thing. If it takes you 10 years to build it, the cost goes up about tenfold. So SMRs can really be a solution, and there's been some skepticism generally. Okay, SMRs look great on paper, it's a wonderful concept, but we don't really have any operating ones. Is this just a PowerPoint presentation? Is it just an idea? Is it real? And I think we're finally in the last year or two starting to see that this is becoming a reality. For all of the reasons that we started discussing today, the need for decarbonization, but also the need to have something that can be deployed on a faster scale with less capital, you're actually starting to see real projects being developed with actual sites. That to me is when it starts becoming real, when there's an actual site. And that site is starting to be developed for a particular reactor, or at least the perimeter for several reactors. And you actually have, as a lawyer, one thing I really, really hate, I can tell you, are MOUs, Memorandum of Understanding. And here in North America, I've been doing MOUs for 15 years. I'm finally now negotiating real contracts to purchase real equipment, like the real hardware. So that to me is a signal that this is real. Somebody's spending money, putting that down payment to buy a widget, not just to produce more services, an engineering report and put together a proud presentation for a nice conference. So that's, all very exciting. But I still retain some dose of reality, right? That we're now at a point where we're ordering equipment. We've got a couple of sites, but there's still so much to do, right? If we're going to need to double or triple the capacity of nuclear, 400 gigawatts more, 800 gigawatts more of nuclear online, that is a lot. That's a lot of projects, a lot of investment, and a lot of potential to fail. Very frankly. So these projects, they look like they're doing the right thing, right? They're taking into account the lessons learned from the large projects. They're approaching new licensing pathways. They're getting other parts of the industry involved. They're trying to reduce costs. But we actually have to have scale in order for these to become a reality. So this presentation, there are a lot of things that I've been advocating for that need to be done to make this new nuclear market a reality, and also to bring in private funds into it. And there's a role for everyone involved. So one, there's a role for government, right? The governments really need to recognize the zero carbon value of nuclear and invest into nuclear the same way that they have invested in renewables and other infrastructure to scale it up. So we're already seeing a lot of that across the world. Right here in the United States, We're seeing the Department of Energy with its Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. We now have the Inflation Reduction Act with tax credits that are for clean electricity and specifically include nuclear. So nuclear is now on the same level paying as renewables where it previously wasn't. We've got loan guarantees available for nuclear. And we're seeing that in other countries like Canada that is also supporting nuclear, actually investing into some of the new technologies and providing different types of incentives to do it. So for us to really get the market started, these demos need to be funded, right? Because nobody wants to be the first one. No private entity is going to want to invest their money into essentially what is a PowerPoint presentation. And you know, to be very frank, that's where a lot of things start out, right? Somebody comes up with a concept, it's an engineering idea, it looks great, you know, it's got this, you know, coolant that will ensure that the fuel can never melt, you know, to some of the questions about safety, you know, it's got these cost reduction mechanisms, but it actually needs to be a reality and it needs to actually be proven and operational. So we really need the governments to invest into these first of a kinds because private industry is not going to do so. And then the debt as well, right? We need the equity, we need the actual capital costs, but everything can be financed with, you know, 100% dollar per dollar. We need the governments to provide some debt for the demos as well. And that's being done, you know, across the board already in some ways. We have the loan guarantee program in the US. In Canada, we have the Canadian Infrastructure Bank that has provided $708 million to the new reactors, the BWRX 300s in Ontario. But there are many other pieces still missing. You know, one is licensing and supply chain. So the licensing regimes today are designed for large light water reactors, generally across the board. You know, in Canada, they were more designed for pressurized heavy water reactors. We don't really have licensing regimes that have been designed for small modular reactors, for some of those, you know, safety features, like the fact that you have fuel that can't melt, the fact that you don't need as many operators, the fact that you can site them much closer to population centers, which is also important for use in industrial end uses, because a lot of industry is not located in the boondocks, right? They're located close to population centers. So the regimes really need to be adjusted for this, and there are efforts to do that, but, you know, there's still a lot of work to be done, especially here in the US. We have a very prescriptive regime. And then issues like some of you may be aware of the high assay low enriched uranium issue. So you have to have a uranium that's enriched to slightly higher levels for advanced reactors. We don't have that available in the market today, especially not in the West. There's some capacity in China and in Russia. Makes it hard given the geopolitics today. So there needs to be a lot of investment by governments too into those types of supply chain issues to ramp them up until private industry can jump in. But, you know, kind of in the nuclear industry, we tend to put a lot of onus and blame on government. Yes, it's the government's fault, the government's not providing the right policies, the government's not providing enough money, and that is very true. We definitely need more support from government, but industry itself also has to organize or really reorganize in order to create this new market. So right now, the way that things are done in the industry is that projects are approached in very much on a case-by-case basis, right? So you've got one utility or one potential end user, they have a project that they're doing, and we advise on a lot of these projects, and I swear to God, every time a company approaches me with a new project, it's like they've never built nuclear before anywhere in the world. Like, we're looking at this for the very first time. We've got this new technology we're building. We're going to invent the contract from scratch. We're going to just do it in a vacuum. And it's like, no, guys, you know, there's 400 gigawatts of nuclear operating. We've done this before. And maybe we haven't done it in the US consistently lately, but it's been done everywhere else, and it's been done in many other places successfully. And by the way, your neighbor down the street, your utility, and like, you know, the one state over, they're doing the same exercise. And you guys are not talking to each other, and you're talking to the same vendors. So, you know, what we really need is a lot more collaboration industry-wide. We're starting to see some of that. One really good example is you've got OPG in Canada that is working with TVA in the United States and with Synthos in Poland, which is actually not a utility, they're an industrial player, and they're jointly co-funding the detailed design for the GE small modular reactor. And they're going to share costs to bring that reactor online to basically speed up the development timeline and bring that reactor online in the same time, hopefully the same time in Canada, US, and Poland. And that means that one, they share all the costs, right, in the early development, then they share lessons learned, and they also cooperate on the development of a fleet of reactors, which means better supply chain, lower costs, kind of better across the board. So we're seeing, this happening on a case-by-case basis, but we really do need to have a lot more collaboration across the potential end users to make this a reality. There's also a role for industry to reach outside of our kind of, typical end users, our nuclear circle. So historically, the end users for nuclear energy are the electric utilities, right? They're the customers. Electric utilities are not great investors because, they're utility companies, right? They're not competing with anybody. They're very conservative. They have to answer to utility commissions. They're not risk takers by their very nature. So here we're talking about these novel technologies, novel deployment methods, and then we're taking the guys who are probably the most risk averse, and we're asking them to take that risk. Not the best method. You've got a ton of other potential players out there that are under pressure to decarbonize for various reasons, right? And some of them, it's their own survival. They've got to answer to ESG guidelines and pressures from investors, where some of these companies cannot get debt from the investment communities unless they decarbonize. And I'm talking about, the oil and gas guys. You've got similarly, voluntary commitments, but also similar pressure on a lot of the big companies, which are, the tech industry, right? It's the Microsofts and the Amazons of the world and the Googles of the world that suck up a lot of energy, right, to be able to operate things like data centers, to be able to do all the logistics. All of us get all the stuff from Amazon, right? It requires a lot of energy to be delivered to you. You use cloud services for all of your documents, huge amounts of energy. So these companies need the energy. And I think until recently, they really haven't been a target for the industry to say, hey, we could really help you decarbonize with our technologies, but you've got the big balance sheets and you have research and development budgets. Why don't you help us out by investing? I think that's finally coming together. We're seeing, for example, Dow, of course, one of the world's biggest chemical companies signed an agreement with X Energy, where they're actually going to be the very first buyer of that reactor. But we need to see a lot more of that across the board. We really need to close the loop with industry. And then, of course, this is kind of a given, but the industry has to learn from past mistakes. As I mentioned, a lot of times these projects are being pursued like they haven't been ever pursued before. We need to think of all of the things that have gone wrong in the large projects, and we need to address them in the small modular reactor deployment. But we also have to think about some of the things that could really go wrong with the SMRs. So I was talking before about, all the risks in construction and trying to decrease those risks with modularization and manufacturing. But guess what? There are risks on the manufacturing side too. We've seen some of these issues in some of the nuclear deployments where the facilities that were manufacturing some of the equipment didn't have the right nuclear standards or couldn't comply with them, or didn't have staff that was familiar with nuclear, couldn't abide by the quality assurance requirements. So these are all the things we have to think about. What are the risk points? We really have to address those, because without that, we're going to have failed projects, demos, and unfortunately, it's going to undercut our ability to really scale the nuclear industry. So even with all of that said, we still have gaps. Even if we do all the right things, we've got the government support, we've got new end users, and we've got the industry doing what it's supposed to do, we still have gaps. And why do we have those gaps? If you look at how infrastructure is financed worldwide, In developing economies, almost 100% of it is financed with support from multilateral institutions. That's the World Bank, that's the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, all the regional development banks. And these banks, even in developed economies, for example, the European Infrastructure Bank has been responsible for financing a lot of the European infrastructure right in Europe. These banks do not finance nuclear. The World Bank has specifically a policy that says we do not finance nuclear, in the same vein that we don't finance terrorism and child trafficking. It's a really, really great list to be part of. And there are other banks, if you look at the European Infrastructure Bank, they're actually supposed to finance nuclear, but they don't. And why don't they? Because they've never financed it before. And they don't know anything about nuclear technology. Their perception is that it's risky. Maybe there are safety issues they don't know about because they haven't asked the question. They're worried about their cost overruns, schedule delays, all of those typical things that we talk about. And I've worked for several years on campaigns to try to change the policy of the World Bank. Because if you look at who actually are the top members of the World Bank, the countries that have nuclear. It's the United States, it's France, it's China, but it's not changing because everything operates on consensus. So a country like Luxembourg, is very anti-nuclear. If they're part of a working group, they can single-handedly influence a policy because they essentially have a veto right. If you just have a single anti-nuclear member. So for that reason, I've become involved with a concept that's grown and an initiative that's really grown over the past 2 years to establish the International Bank for Nuclear Infrastructure. Sometimes we call it the World Bank for Nuclear. So what we're trying to do is use all of these existing mechanisms that already exist, right? For every dollar that the World Bank finances, they get $100 from private industry or from other governments, from sovereign wealth funds. So this is a proven way to finance infrastructure, whether power or anything that involves building some sort of an asset. So we can use that across the board, but because nuclear, for good and for bad, it's special, right? It's special for all the positive things it can do, but it's also, unfortunately, special in that, it has these regulatory challenges. It's very complex, difficult for average people to understand, and doesn't have any experience with global financial institutions because they've never financed it. So the idea is to have a bank, the members of which are countries that support nuclear. So it's either countries that already have nuclear or that want to have nuclear in the future. The governance is done exactly the same way as the World Bank or any other institution. The structure is already there to be able to dip into money from private markets, but it will have the nuclear expertise. It will have a realistic view of the risks and rewards of nuclear. So it won't scrutinize it from an anti-nuclear viewpoint. And it'll also be able to address some of the issues that I talked about, set the right standards so that we can actually have successful nuclear projects, right? The way it will work is that somebody wants money from the bank will be able to come and say, we're only going to finance successful projects. So your project needs to be de-risked in all of the following ways so that it's actually a success and we can bring in money from private markets. So this initiative is underway. We're trying to get 7 governments as kind of the co-founders of the bank: US, Canada, France, UK, Japan, Korea, and the UAE. We've been engaging with all of these governments. We've gotten some really positive traction. We're trying to get a declaration at COP28. At least several of these governments, they are supportive of the creation of this bank. So we really are on a good trajectory there, largely because we have these needs for decarbonization and energy security that nuclear can provide. But we're looking for more support. So any organizations that want to support this concept, very welcome to join in on the campaign. And if you have any questions, this is typically like a 2-hour presentation on the bank. So happy to share with you any information. And thanks very much for the opportunity.
Hello, is this thing on? I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, if anybody has any. Yeah, come around with the mic.
Whoop, sorry. Hi, just to say number 1, we're really fortunate to have you here. In the model you're talking about, just talk about maybe the the OPG, Synthos, TVA. How do you reconcile the supply chain for that model? Because we're going to build one in Canada, and now with all the funding with the IRA and all the tax credits here and there, and whether I can't imagine that the world, the US and the Polish are going to let Canada be the supply chain for the world, because they're going to build lots of these things. How do you reconcile that part of this picture?
It's a really good question, because absolutely every government says we're going to fund nuclear. They also say we want to have everything manufactured right here, whether it's U.S. or Canada or or Poland. I think it's going to have to be a blend. So you can have in a global supply chain for some parts, and there will be some parts that will be localized. The easy thing to localize is anything that's local, right? All the surrounding infrastructure, the construction is going to have to be local. Some of the supplying could be local, but truthfully, you will need to have global supply. And I think there's a little bit of a misperception, for example, under the IRA, that everything has to be U.S. Most things don't have to be U.S. It's only steel and iron, and manufactured content with steel and iron, that's 55%. So there's significant room for a global supply chain, but certainly it's a balance that you're going to have to play, because it's a political issue, right? You're going to have to grow the local industry, but if you have a 100% local supply chain, it's just never going to work.
One more question.
Hi. This is fabulous. Do you and the bank have a way of solving the dilemma that I've seen in nuclear against other sources, where nuclear plants can last 80 years, but the financing for building them has to be paid back in 10 or 15, but there's got to be a way to solve that, and I wondered if you guys have a solution.
So, honestly, it hasn't been that the payback is not the problem, because once the plant is operational, you can pay back the money. The issue is getting the money in the first place. Because the way that banks typically look at it, commercial banks, right, they don't have a strategic objective. Their objective is to get the return on their dollar as soon as possible. So typically for project finance timelines, you're looking at 2.5, 3 years max. Until the banks want to start see revenue generated and payback, and that hasn't been possible for nuclear. And frankly, even for most SMRs, that's still a very, very ambitious endeavor. So the idea here is that the bank, the IBNI, has a strategic standpoint, right, where they can come in and they can say, okay, we can be patient capital. We can bring in the capital that's needed initially for you to start construction. And then once construction's on the way and it looks closer, then there are lots of other sources of funds that you can tap into.
I'll ask one last quick question. If you could kind of give your personal review of the Inflation Reduction Act and the inclusion of nuclear in the EU green taxonomy, do you think this is a small step for the industry or a big step, or how would you recommend it to be changed in the future by politicians?
So the IRA, I think, is great because, it does put nuclear on the same level field as renewables. It's the same, the production tax credits for wind and solar are what have allowed the costs to really come down for those facilities, and also bringing in private capital to do, project finance for those facilities. So it's very positive for nuclear to actually have those credits. It's still an issue, the same issue that I talked about with, the long deployment timelines. Even with production tax credits, you're not going to have project finance because commercial institutions are going to come in and support a project that's not going to generate revenue for 6 to 7 years. So that's still an issue. I think once we have the demos underway in the United States, and by demos I don't just mean one, but I mean 4 to 8 of each one, then I think the timelines come down, the costs come down, and then you can start getting in private capital using the production tax credits. I also think some of the other tax credits, for example, for hydrogen, where you can also use the tax credit for the hydrogen production, and you can use the electricity tax credit for the underlying nuclear facility, is helpful. The EU, that could be a whole separate conversation. I think inclusion in taxonomy is better than not being included, but at the same time, nuclear has been dubbed as transitional, which is actually, it even contravenes the definition of what nuclear is being classified under the taxonomy, right? The EU has stated we're going to need nuclear to keep operating, at least. Not ramp up, but to keep operating, but they're calling it transitional because Sustainable was defined as renewable. So that's still a little bit of a perception issue, but frankly, the taxonomy is just a reporting obligation. It does not actually bring, hard dollars into the projects. So I think in the EU, there's still a lot more need to figure out where is that money going to come from to finance new nuclear in the EU.
Well, thank you so much. That was such a wealth of information. So please, let's have a round of applause and go to our next speaker.